everyone, welcome back to the channel, or hi if you're new here. I'm Jade, and I thought I'd do something a little bit different. So we're still sticking with the theme of books, obviously, for my channel, but let's talk about reading slumps. I have seen so many posts in book groups I'm in lately of people saying they're in a reading slump. Obviously, there's different reasons. Some people, they just don't know, they just don't have that desire to pick up a book. For other people, like sadly, I have seen some people say it's because, they've gone through something quite tragic, whether that be losing someone, a breakup, different things. So obviously your emotions often affect your desire to read. Yeah, there's so many reasons you can be in a reading slump. So I feel like there's different tips and tools to sort of bring that desire back, which I will get onto. So I've sort of come up with my top 5 ways to get out of a reading slump. I think some will apply to some people more than others, depending on, the reason for the reading slump. But I was going to suggest books, and I will talk probably a little bit about books that I would pick, but I think it's kind of individual, right? I feel like for each person, it could be a different book, which is why I'm going to do more generalized tips, because I could suggest books, but I feel like, that really relies on you having the exact same taste as me, which, let's face it, most people have slightly different opinions. We might have similar taste in books, but I feel like there's always going to be those differences. So I just thought general tips would be better. But before we get into that, I want to talk about what is a reading slump. You might be like, duh, like it's, when you're not desiring to read. But actually, I do think it is quite an important question, because I was actually asked it by my friend. We were sort of having this talk about reading slumps because it had come up in conversation. And she was like, well, what is a reading slump? Because surely if you just don't want to read, you just don't read. And that seems like the obvious answer, doesn't it? Like, if you don't want to read, don't read. And I do stand by that. I don't think anyone should feel any pressure to read. If you just don't feel like reading, you don't have to. But for me, a reading slump is when my desire to read, which is often quite strong, is just suddenly like not there. And I don't really know why, or maybe I do know why, but I wish it was still there. I just can't bring that desire back. I think reading slumps kind of affect people that read more regularly, because then you notice that your desire to read isn't there. So for me, let me know what you think a reading slump is, or what it is for you. Please let me know, because I do think it is slightly individualized. But for me, it is when that desire, when I usually love reading, I just don't have that desire to pick up a book. And, whether there's a reason for it or not, it's me wishing to have that desire back, but just not being able to grasp it. So for example, my worst reading slump ever was when I finished university, because at university, I was made to read 4 books a week, which is obviously quite a tall order when it's things that I wouldn't usually pick to read for enjoyment. Now, don't get me wrong, I found some of the books really great, but overall, I read a lot of books that are just not my thing, that I didn't enjoy, and I was just forcing myself to read at this fast pace of things that I just wasn't really enjoying. And therefore, it kind of killed my love for reading for a while. So when I left university and then had more time to read what I wanted again, I just really struggled. I just didn't have that desire to pick up a book like I did. I grew up reading so much, I used to read all the time, and I just kind of lost that a little bit when I left university. And honestly, I would say it was only about 5 years ago that I really got back into reading again. I'd read the odd book and really enjoy it, don't get me wrong, but to read to a higher level again, like I do now, it took several years after university. And that was definitely my worst ever reading slump. So anyway, let's get on to my 5 top tips for getting out of a reading slump. But please do tell me what you think a reading slump is for you, because I'm interested in that. Okay, so tip number 1 for getting out of a reading slump. And I feel like this is quite a good one for anyone who's in a reading slump. That is to pick up a book that you have previously loved. Or a series, can be a whole series if you want to commit that time, but just pick something that you love and you just know that you like. And I feel like it's a safe bet to just kind of get you back into reading. Obviously, if you're that kind of person that hates rereading anything, because I know there are people like that, they feel like it's a waste of time when there's so many others to be read, which I totally get. Maybe this tip isn't for you, but I feel like for most people, if you're in a reading slump, pick up something that you used to really love. The reason I suggest this is A, because you're going to like it, but B, because it just doesn't take quite the same focus or concentration, because you already know the story. And therefore, if you do zone out or you struggle a little bit, I just feel like it kind of gives you that grace to just think, oh, it's fine. I can do it. And then you get back into it. I just think picking something you just know you're going to love is always a good idea. So yeah, that is my main tip, number one, because that tends to be what works for me. I went back to a lot of my sort of favorite young adult books after university, and that's kind of how I slowly worked my way back into reading. Tip number two, start with reading something shorter or easier. So if you like them, it could be like short stories, even poetry, I guess. I don't feel for me that would get me right back into reading, but I know for some people it would. So yeah, maybe short stories, poetry, or just like a shorter, easier book. Maybe just something that has short chapters, because I find if I'm struggling and concentrating, having short chapters really makes me focus, because then I feel like I've achieved something, because I'm like, oh, I've read a chapter. It might not be that much, but it just makes me feel like I'm getting into it. So I sometimes find that a bit easier than like fighting my way through long chapters, or even just like an easier, shorter book, like going back to a young adult book, rather than some heavy thing. Even if you're someone who usually reads heavy, maybe you just need that kind of break for your brain and pick something a little bit easier. So that is tip number two, something shorter and easier. Tip number three is setting low pressured goals with your reading. I know for some people, setting goals just puts them off completely. And if this isn't for you, it isn't for you. But for me, I quite like having a goal with reading. It makes me think, oh, I should be reading. But if I set it too hard for myself, I feel like it then makes me not want to read because I feel too much pressure. But if I set just something that is low pressure, I feel like it really helps me. So obviously there are more long-term goals like you have on Goodreads, like how many books you want to read in the year. For example, I set mine to 25 this year. I think I'm already at 20, 19 or 20 at the moment. Slightly above actually, maybe now. I'm not sure. I'm around 20, okay? So I'm obviously easily going to achieve that this year. But if stuff happens in my life or for any reason, I knew that was an easy goal for me. So it gave me something to aim towards and have like a minimum, but without feeling any pressure. Because for me, it is just terrible if I feel too much pressure. Maybe you're someone that's driven by more pressure. So if you want to go for those higher goals, go for it, because yay, just, you know what works for you. But for me, setting that lower pressure, so obviously, as I said, the longer term goals, but you could also have shorter goals, like to get yourself back into reading. You could say, oh, I'll read one chapter a day as a minimum. I would always set it as a minimum, because if you're into a book, you don't want your goal to be like, well, I've read my chapter, now I can't read anymore. Obviously, like read as much as you want to. However, I just think it's a good idea to have that kind of goal. If chapters are too much for you and a struggle right now, a page a day, you can go down to a page a day and it's still reading and it's still going into your goals. And it doesn't matter how easy your goals are. Everyone's going to be different. But I just feel like sometimes having that goal just kind of gives you that little bit of something in your brain to like motivate you to actually read. So that's another tip. Tip number 4 is to join a book club. You might think, well, there aren't any around me. But it doesn't have to be an in-person book club. It could be to follow along with an online thing. For example, Fable. I'm going to talk about the app Fable because it has online book groups in there. There are so many, and you can often find them by book as well if there's something you were thinking about reading. And I just feel like having these like discussion posts and having someone to discuss the book with can just make you more intrigued and want to read more. You could say it kind of links to the whole goals thing, because obviously if you join a book group, usually it's like a book a month. So it kind of gives you a bit more of a deadline. But I just think having someone to discuss with, even if it's just an online group chat, I just think it's a great thing. And with Fable, how it works is once you join it into there, it breaks it down into chapters and you can comments on each chapter as you go. So you don't have to see any spoilers. And you can talk about that chapter with people if something interesting happens or whatever, or you can just share your thoughts at the end if you'd prefer, just in like the end of the chat once you finish the book. But I just think having that sort of social aspect and knowing people are sort of reading with you can really help to encourage you to keep reading. So yeah, that is my tip number 4, because I've really enjoyed doing that on Fable. I do also go to an in-person book club, which kind of makes me read things that maybe I wouldn't usually pick up. And it does encourage me to do that. So even though I'm not in a reading slump right now, I would say being in a book club encourages me to read books that maybe I wouldn't actually have the desire to read otherwise. So I kind of see it as a good thing. And my final tip, number 5, is if you're really struggling to get back into a book or whatever, change the genre. If you're someone that always only reads one genre, you might struggle with this a little bit more. I really like romance, fantasy, thriller. I would say I like my three main genres, and obviously they do change a bit. I mean, I read a bit of anything, like, you know, it can link in like historical fiction or mystery, etc. But I would say they're like my three primary genres. And so I know I could change it up a bit. And you will probably notice if you've watched like my wrap up so far this year, I do tend to mix it up quite a lot in the month. That's just because for me, it does kind of refresh my palette, and I don't compare books as strongly, because I feel like if I read a lot of fantasies back to back or any of the genres, I start comparing them a little bit more and feeling a little bit more judgmental. That might just be me, but so, you know, as a result, I just kind of enjoy it if I do change it up a little bit, what I read within a month. Um, and so maybe if you're someone that always reads something, maybe just change the genre, you know, have a bit of a palette cleanser. So, for example, I know not everyone's going to like her. Frida McFadden, her books are so easy, and I get absorbed into them really easy, but they're so easy to read. I feel like they're a really good palette cleanser for me, because sometimes I'll go for some heavier fantasies, like where I'm trying to work out, you know, the lore of the book. And for me, just having this like easy, absorbable thriller to break things up really, really helps me. So yeah, that's just an example. But like I said, there's loads out there, but maybe just pick even just like a shorter book just to break things up a little bit in a different genre. I think that could be really helpful, especially if you feel your reading is affected by your mood or something that's happened in your life. Like, and it's going to be different for different people, but if you've gone through loss, maybe you want to avoid those sad books because it's going to bring too much heartache to you. But some people find it cathartic because they just get absorbed into it and they kind of let out their own feelings by crying with the book. You know what works for you. You know what works for you. But they're just kind of, you know, my suggestions of changing things up. Or, you know, if you're a regular romance reader, but you've gone through a breakup and you just can't face it, maybe go for a thriller. Try changing it up a little bit, rather than, you know, give up with books altogether. But I will stress 100%, if you really, really don't feel like reading, do not feel pressured to. Despite these tips, which are to help you if you really kind of want that desire for reading back, but if it doesn't bother you and you really just don't want to read, just don't read. Honestly. I feel like sometimes people feel within the book communities that people judge on that. They're like, oh, this person reads so much, so, you know, they're going to judge me if I don't read. But I don't agree. I think you should always read the amount you want, never feel pressured. So this is kind of my little chit chat on reading slumps. As I said, let me know what you feel a reading slump is for you, because I do think it is very individualized and it's kind of just an interesting topic for me. And I hope some of these tips help. If you have any really good tips, please leave them in the comments. And yeah, I will see you again for another video real soon. Bye!